All right, let's get some analysis on this story now. Specialist reporter Karen Morn is in the Newsday studio. Karen, in our line of work, we've seen it all. This story, though, just horrific.
You know, the thing is with mentally ill people is that they are so innately vulnerable because they can't communicate the levels of their victimization very often in an articulate and meaningful way. And having gone through this report and seen how there was this rushed decision to move people who had, in many cases, other pre-existing chronic medical conditions, including hypertension, including other TB, to facilities where their records weren't even provided, Michelle, that there are findings that people would go to these NGOs in which, they were private residential properties in which family members were moved out, in which people were in no way equipped or trained to provide medical care, let alone psychiatric care. And people arrived there with these pre-existing medical conditions and no record of their actual conditions. You know, it is completely and utterly horrifying, and it is an indictment on this country about the way we treat the mentally ill.
And it's exactly why, listening to Gauteng Premier David Makhura just a few minutes ago, saying he deeply regrets the deaths of these 94 patients. It just doesn't seem enough.
Well, you know what the worst is that there was litigation. You know, entities went to court and said, if you do this, people will lose their lives. And the Gauteng Health Department went on record. They challenged that litigation. They gave assurances, particularly in terms of the Takalani facility. And they gave assurances to the court. This is not a situation in which they didn't have a warning, a forewarning of what was going to happen. And the profound indictment of the Life Isidimeni report is that these deaths could have been avoided. It absolutely acknowledges the fact that mentally ill people do tend to have a lower life expectancy, that there are conditions that they suffer from which may lead them to die prematurely. But what is horrifying is that you have psychiatrically ill people who are put into private residences, who are not licensed, who do not have adequate ability to provide the kind of level of psychiatric care which is required. And then there's no sense in which the warnings of the officials in the health department were ever taken into account. There's a quite profound indictment of Dani Mishlangu in this report, in that it's routinely said that she was warned, that her own staff, there was a culture of fear within that department, and that people were raising their hands and saying, you simply can't do that. There was a memo, there was litigation, but they went ahead regardless, and people have died as a consequence.
Well, Dani Mishlangu notably absent from that briefing. There was really no other option, some are saying, other than for her to tender her resignation. Section 27's Mark Haywood raising a very important point, asking, are there going to be criminal investigations into this?
Well, you know, this is a profound point here, because it's not just about culpable homicide charges with regards to the deaths of these patients, in which this report finds there was gross negligence. Because if you're not supplying someone who has a condition of hypertension with their medication, they are going to go into significant distress and they are going to die. There's talk of bruises on the bodies of the deceased. There's talk of people being unable to breathe, dying in the most horrific circumstances. It's not just about the deaths themselves. Mark Haywood asking, is there going to be a systemic investigation around possible corruption, about a decision which seems so irrational, so against the interests of patients, so against the constitutional mandate that is required of government to exercise due diligence and care. He's asking, was this decision informed by potentially corrupt motives? And of course, we've heard from the Ombudsman saying, the police are involved, but there needs to be a systemic investigation. I think Mark Haywood is absolutely right on that, as to what was the motive that informed this rushed, chaotic, completely inappropriate decision by the health department to remove these people from a facility where they were getting adequate care to private residences where no one was in any way meaningfully and significantly equipped to deal with the very specific needs needs of these psychiatric patients.
Some shocking numbers coming out of this report from the Ombud, among them that 1 out of these 94 people died of an illness related to their actual mental condition. The MEC announcing in September last year that 36 people had died. That was the point at which 77 patients had already died. I mean, how is it that record keeping of these most vulnerable of South Africans went so badly wrong?
I think one of the most horrific parts of this whole report is where they asked Gudani Mhlangu about the numbers of the dead, and she said that it was a political game, that there was, in her version, an admission of the numbers of the dead would somehow fall into the realms of politics. And I think that is a profound indictment. I think one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this is reading this report and seeing that hunger and cold were listed as contributing factors to the deaths, that people may have actually starved to death because the facilities where they were being kept were simply not feeding them. And I think in this day and age, I don't know that that is not an indictment as to this country and our treatment of the mentally ill. And there have to be, just beyond the realm of Gudani Mhlangu resigning, there have to be consequences for this because it's simply unacceptable.
Plenty more to discuss, but that is where we leave it. Specialist reporter Karen Morn, thanks so much for coming in.